Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Link, The Faces of Evil, a side-scrolling action platforming title developed by Animation Magic and published by Philips Interactive Media for the Philips CDI console back in 1993. We're going to look at that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 106. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. Everything is out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Link, The Faces of Evil. Link, The Faces of Evil is a side-scrolling action platforming title developed by Animation Magic and published by Philips Interactive Media for the Philips CDI console back in 1993. Before we can talk about The Faces of Evil, we need to go back and talk about how the heck Nintendo allowed one of its most prized characters and franchises to be licensed to a totally unrelated non-Nintendo gaming system. Our story involves three major players: Philips, a large multi-product company based in the Netherlands, and two Japanese juggernauts, those being Nintendo and Sony. Before we begin though, I should mention that part of this history is very similar to the discussion we had when talking about Hotel Mario all the way back in episode 15 of the podcast. Hotel Mario, as well as The Faces of Evil and two other Zelda series titles, Wand of Gamelon and Zelda's Adventure, all effectively originated from the same agreement between Philips and Nintendo, and as such, they all have the same origin story. Before Nintendo and Philips were partners in crime though, Sony and Philips had maintained a long-standing, if not somewhat competitive partnership, as they both jointly developed the concepts behind CD-ROM technology as a whole, and were ultimately responsible for the first audio CDs ever made, with the technology conceptualized in 1980, and the first disc released to consumers in 1982. When we think about CD-ROMs, most of the time, we're thinking about either the audio CD format we were just talking about, which after its release became the high-end standard for music distribution for years, or perhaps the CD-ROM discs that caused a tsunami of innovation in the computer and video game market in the 90s, and were responsible for the proliferation of the gaming genre that you all know I love, full-motion video titles. But the reality is that CDs as a form of media supported a pretty large number of underlying formats, most of which were spearheaded by, you might have guessed it, Sony and Philips in some form or fashion. So let's talk about the different kinds of CDs that were developed and what they were ultimately used for. We already mentioned the audio CD format, which was effectively just that. Discs that housed a series of audio tracks that were playable on a variety of CD players, whether attached to stereos, car dashboards, or your hip, as was the case with the venerable Sony Discman device. When the audio CD format was created, the concept of storing user-accessible data on a disc was not even a thing yet. That particular technology, the well-known CD-ROM format, was still years away. But that didn't stop manufacturers like Sony and Philips from coining some interesting terms and phrases to describe the various formats that they were working on. And here, they used a naming convention that has colloquially come to be known as rainbow formats. You might be wondering, what the heck is a rainbow format? Well, the answer to that question is somewhat embedded in the name, as rainbows by definition are comprised of a series of colors like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, as anyone who has taken science up through around the second grade can attest to. What's more interesting and pertinent to our discussion is the way that Philips and Sony used these colors to describe the various formats of CDs they were in the process of creating. You might have heard the term Red Book Audio before to describe a game or some other software that contained CD quality audio. And honestly, when you hear that phrase, Red Book Audio, it sounds kind of mysterious and prestigious. Well, it turns out the reason software with CD quality audio is described as having Red Book Audio is simply because the audio CD format was defined and described in a book featuring a red colored cover, hence the name Red Book Audio. Beyond the well-known Red Book Audio format, there were also a number of other formats that companies were working on. There was the Green Book CD, which represented a new type of CD called the Compact Disc Interactive format that Philips was keen on defining and exploring. There was also the Yellow Book format, which was used for the definition of the CD-ROM technology that would eventually come to be used on computers. There was even an Orange Book format, which would define the concept of recordable CD-ROM media, which, by the way, was denoted as orange because it was the combination of two other formats, that being Red Book Audio and Yellow Book CD-ROM technology. Red plus yellow equals orange, hence the name for the format. Undeniably, there were a number of CD formats being explored and developed for future use across the audio storage and gaming industries, and many companies were trying to really push the formats forward, chief amongst them Sony and Philips. One company, however, was seemingly opposed to the use of CDs in any of their products. That company, you may have guessed, was Nintendo. Ever since Nintendo began dominating the home video game console market in the 1980s, they defined their company strategy as being one that effectively marched to the beat of its own drum. While other console manufacturers and video game developers would often seek to evolve their own offerings by adopting and then improving upon common technology trends that were prevalent in industry, Nintendo was always the kind of company that looked at those technology trends and basically said, thanks, but no thanks, as they continued to do whatever the heck they wanted to do, believing their way to be the best way, and assuming other companies didn't really know what they were doing. This general company strategy would continue for years, and when Nintendo was at the top of the market, there was really no reason to deviate from that strategy. The console wars of the early 90s, though, made Nintendo begin to think about things a little differently, as long-standing game developer and hardware company Sega began stealing Nintendo's market share through a combination of cutting-edge advertising and more mature action-packed video game offerings, eventually leading to Sega capturing the top spot in the home console market, at least here in the United States. Sega's strategy, unlike Nintendo's more stable approach, was focused on constant evolution and innovation, which resulted in some huge successes, as well as some pretty significant market flops. Say what you will about Sega's efforts and accomplishments in the video game industry, but one thing you cannot deny is that all of the competitive fire that drove them to the top of the market certainly made Nintendo stand up and take notice, and one of the devices that Sega ended up bringing to market in 1991 would further cause Nintendo to rethink their own internal strategies, that being the Sega CD. The Sega CD was an add-on peripheral for the Sega Genesis, and was designed to take advantage of the rapidly exploding CD-ROM format that was taking the computer gaming industry by storm, which, by the way, was the Yellow Book format, just to tie this back to our prior discussion. Anyway, the Sega CD provided Sega with the first truly distinct hardware innovation over a Nintendo system, and the storage provided by CDs was something Nintendo could not compete with given their cartridge-centric focus. So, Nintendo began to double down on the creation of their own CD-ROM-based add-on peripheral for their 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And here, because Nintendo had literally no experience with CD-ROM technology or CDs as a form of media, they turned to someone in the industry that did in fact have some knowledge of that format, that being the electronics giant Sony. Interestingly, before exploring a CD-ROM-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, Sony and Nintendo had maintained an active partnership that saw Sony design and develop the audio chip that would eventually be used in every single Super Nintendo ever manufactured. That effort was primarily the work of one man, an engineer by the name of Ken Kutaragi. In the mid-80s, Kutaragi had been incredibly impressed by the Nintendo Famicom system, and in particular, he enjoyed watching his daughter play games on Nintendo's industry-leading 8-bit console. Kutaragi desperately wanted to work with Nintendo on some project, but there was just one problem. Kutaragi was a Sony engineer, and the two companies didn't have any sort of active partnership in place that would allow them to collaborate with one another on any sort of future initiative. Kutaragi, however, was not deterred, and here, he ended up doing something that could have literally been a career ender, as he reached out to Nintendo directly and offered to develop the audio chip for Nintendo's forthcoming 16-bit console, the Super Famicom. Nintendo, recognizing Sony's expertise in the audio technology space, quickly agreed to the deal, and Kutaragi began working on that chip design. There was just one problem. Sony leadership had no idea that Kutaragi was working on an audio chip for Nintendo's upcoming system, and there was no formal company-level agreement in place between the two technology giants. Kutaragi had effectively gone rogue, and Sony leadership was not happy about it. There was a very real possibility of that work ending and Kutaragi being fired on the spot, if not for the support of one Sony executive, a man by the name of Norio Oga, who was a president at the company and would, several years later, become the chief executive officer or CEO for all of Sony. At the point Oga threw his backing behind Kutaragi, though, there was still no guarantee that it would be enough support to save Kutaragi's job, and the work he had been performing to date creating Nintendo's next-generation audio chip. Luckily for all involved, though, Oga was able to convince the rest of Sony leadership to allow that work to continue, and Kutaragi was able to finish his passion project, delivering the audio chip that would power the Super Famicom and, in the process, strengthening the now formalized partnership between the two companies. So, when the time came for Nintendo to begin exploring a CD-based add-on for their Super Famicom/Super Nintendo line of 16-bit consoles, Sony was on the short list of prospective partners. and it didn't take long before the two began collaborating on the technology that would eventually become known as the Super Disc CD format. Because, of course, Nintendo couldn't just adopt a pre-existing CD format. That was simply not the Nintendo way. Regardless, initial discussions of the new CD-based format got started in 1988, which the observant amongst you may realize was several years before the Sega CD's eventual launch. It might go without saying, but creating new hardware and technology requires a good deal of lead time, which oftentimes means years of designing and prototyping before a company reaches a finished product. Sega was well underway into the development of their Sega CD at the point Nintendo began pursuing this new Super Disc format, and NEC had already released their CD-ROM add-on for the PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16 depending on where you lived. So it stands to reason that Nintendo would begin their own exploration into the technology, even though that exploration had a decidedly Nintendo slant to it. Anyway, under the terms of the agreement between Sony and Nintendo, Nintendo would receive the CD-based add-on for their Super Nintendo system, while Sony would be allowed to release their own Sony-branded console that would both play the new Super Disc format as well as Super NES cartridges, effectively creating an all-in-one Super Console based on the best technologies from both Nintendo and Sony. This all sounded great in theory, and the two companies on the surface were maintaining a pretty strong working relationship. But behind closed doors, Nintendo wasn't all that keen in continuing to work with Sony, as they felt that the deal between the two companies gave Sony too much control in terms of how they could retain the rights to music and software released on the forthcoming Super Disc format. So, in an act of ultimate corporate secrecy and backstabbing, Nintendo reached out to Sony's CD competitor Philips and brokered a new deal, whereby Philips, rather than Sony, would create Nintendo's add-on peripheral, and in the process, Philips would receive licensing rights to several of Nintendo's most valued franchises, like the Mario and Legend of Zelda series. More on that agreement in just a little bit. First, though, we have to see how this all played out for Sony, as there were plans at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, to formally announce the partnership between Sony and Nintendo. So, on day one of the show, Sony got up on stage and proceeded to announce their forthcoming Super Console, the Sony PlayStation, which was being designed to use the Super Disc format, complete with full Super Nintendo cartridge compatibility. A true win for Sony. And then, on the second day of the show, Nintendo got on stage, as everyone from Sony in the audience was elated to soon hear their second win for the show, the announcement of the partnership between Sony and Nintendo to create the Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on. Only that's not what ended up happening. When the time came for Nintendo to announce their CD-ROM partner, it was Philips, not Sony, who ended up being chosen for the opportunity. To say Sony was shocked would be an understatement. Here they were, sitting in the crowd at a live event and learning with the rest of the crowd in attendance that all of the work and partnership they had completed with Nintendo over the last 3 years had effectively been for nothing. Nintendo jilted Sony at the altar, and the relationship between the two companies never fully recovered. Though that event did pave the way for Sony to completely strike off on its own to create what would become the completely standalone Sony PlayStation system, and in the process, redefine the console video game industry forever. Ken Kutaragi, that Sony engineer whose clandestine work would lead to the creation of the audio subsystem for the Super NES, would become the father of the PlayStation, and was eventually named the president of Sony Interactive Entertainment, the entire video game division of Sony. I'd say both Sony and Kutaragi did okay for themselves in the long run, despite Nintendo's very public snub. Anyway, while Nintendo and Sony's relationship was being irreparably damaged, Nintendo's and Philips' relationship was just getting started. Philips, like I mentioned earlier, was originally Sony's partner in developing CD-based technology and various CD formats in the early 1980s. As the late 80s and early 90s approached, Philips began to develop a grand vision. They were going to release a computer-like CD-based device on the market, primarily for professional use, that would allow for advanced technology demonstrations of products and edutainment titles, with a goal of being used primarily in educational institutions, schools, and other locations where kiosk-like devices could potentially be used to educate the masses, like museums and other places with hands-on learning exhibits. At the same time as Philips was partnering with Nintendo to build a CD-based add-on for the Super NES, it was also readying the release of its own CD software-based system to fulfill the internal technology vision I just mentioned, which would end up being the Compact Disc Interactive, or CDI, console, which was released exclusively to the professional market in 1988, meaning it was not designed or intended to be a video game console. In fact, the original intent of the CDI was to act as a simplified version of a computer, and was designed to be used by individuals who needed to give demonstrations to people while on travel. Think about jobs like pharmaceutical reps traveling to doctors' offices to demo new treatments and drugs. The CDI was small enough that you could travel with it. I mean, technically, it's still pretty heavy, but powerful enough that it could display multimedia visuals with full motion video and advanced for-the-time graphics, in the hopes of wowing potential customers. Despite that initial professional market focus, it didn't take long for Philips to realize that they could potentially take the system into the home market. So in late 1991, they released a version of the console to general consumers, pricing it at $799, which represented a slightly cheaper alternative to the more traditional personal computer market of the time. The thing is though, despite the promise of an interactive integrated multimedia console, home adoption wasn't really happening, and most of the software being released was either reference-based, like museum tours or encyclopedias. Remember, there was no internet with instantly available information available in the early 90s. Or edutainment and kids-focused titles, like talking storybooks or board game recreations, like Connect 4. Philips began thinking that a shift away from edutainment to focus more on video games could potentially help drive adoption. And with that concept in mind, the CDI began being positioned as a home video game console, similar to Nintendo's and Sega's offerings. In 1992, Philips began going for the video game market hard, unveiling a slew of full-motion video titles like Dragon's Lair, Mad Dog McCree, and others for eventual release on the system, featuring a level of quality in the video playback that other systems, and including multimedia computers, simply couldn't touch. Longtime listeners likely recall that I am a huge fan of full-motion video titles in gaming, and by extension, that means I love the Philips CDI console, as it is one of the densest catalogs of FMV titles available on any system. And here, Philips actually took some steps to distinguish themselves when compared to other competing platforms like the Sega CD, with perhaps the biggest feature, as it relates to video playback, being the inclusion of a dedicated MPEG-1 decoding card add-on known as the Digital Video Cartridge, or DVC. The DVC allowed game developers to include full-screen, incredibly high-quality videos in their titles, while also allowing the CDI to play back digital video CDs, yet another CD-based format, in full-screen, full-motion video glory. And I've got to say, the CDI is perhaps the best FMV console to ever make its way to the market, simply because of the inclusion of that high-quality video playback. Now, interestingly, despite Philips' assault on the gaming market in 1992, the CDI had never been designed as a gaming device. It was always intended to be a content consumption device, effectively a simple computer. Philips didn't even offer traditional controllers as part of the base hardware bundles, as by default you'd only receive a television-style remote control when you purchased a CDI, which, by the way, worked absolutely horribly for most games. Picture trying to play a platforming title with a television remote control and an infrared connection. It was, to put it mildly, not great. This limitation is the reason why most CDI games had very limited interactivity, and instead focused on delivering high-quality full-motion video experiences. The console just wasn't designed for deep interactive titles. But that didn't stop various companies from trying to bridge that gap, and Philips, for its part, released a number of peripheral add-on devices for the system, including a more traditional 3-button video game controller, a light gun for use in their various FMV-based shooting titles, a kid-centric oversized trackball device, and, owing to its start as a simplified version of a computer, a typical 2-button mouse. While every peripheral was able to be used with any game released on the system, there were obviously some titles that were better experienced using certain devices, and true Philips CDI proponents would have the equivalent of a cabinet full of dedicated CDI peripherals, all ready at a moment's notice to be used with whatever experience an individual wanted to explore in a given day. This dedicated video gaming shift that Philips was pushing occurred right around the same time as Nintendo was deciding to continue to be Nintendo, as they eventually realized that they didn't actually want to go through with a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. Instead, they would continue to focus on cartridge-based games and systems for the foreseeable future, in a move that would eventually result in the creation of the Nintendo 64, while everyone else in the industry was adopting CD-ROM technology. That, however, is a story for a different day. More pertinent to our discussion is the previously mentioned deal between Philips and Nintendo, born at a time when the Super Nintendo CD add-on was still being considered a potential reality. As part of that deal, recall that Philips was granted the license to utilize Nintendo characters on their CDI home console, and even though the deal for a Super NES CD peripheral fell apart, Nintendo still honored the licensing agreement between themselves and Philips under one condition. Philips could do whatever they wanted with the licenses, using Nintendo characters to grace future titles, whether developed by Philips itself or other companies that Philips would contract with. The only requirement was that Nintendo was to have no direct involvement with the creation of the titles. Philips could do their thing, but Nintendo would not contribute anything else, other than the rights to some pretty iconic Nintendo characters. Philips, as you might expect, said something to the effect of, no problem at all, which is what eventually led to the release of 3 Legend of Zelda games and 1 Mario game on the Philips CDI home console. While I would love to talk about every single one of these titles, for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to focus on 2. Link, The Faces of Evil, and Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon. 2 titles in the Legend of Zelda series that are, for all intents and purposes, sibling products comprising 2 sides of effectively the same coin, as they were both made by the same development team, starred the same voice actors, used the same animation process style and studio, had the same control schemes, shared the same user interface, used the same game engine, and were released on the same exact date. In other words, they were based on the same core game framework, with the only real differences being content related, like the items you could pick up, the stages you would encounter, the story you'd progress through, and the enemies you would face. While we'll only be discussing the Faces of Evil during our pseudo review in a little bit, from a historical perspective, everything we're about to talk about applies to both titles, so it's kind of like a 2-for-1 deal. Anyway, bringing both titles to life would fall to a company named Animation Magic, a Russian-American corporation whose major claim to fame was developing animated sequences for a variety of CD-based software. While their earliest work was focused on these CDI Zelda-based titles, they would end up working on a number of higher-profile games in later years, like King's Quest VII: The Princeless Bride, and the cancelled Warcraft point-and-click adventure game that made the internet rounds years ago. That, however, is also a story for another time. Returning to the creation of Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon, Animation Magic had been contracted directly by Philips to work on the 2 titles, with Nintendo providing no direct involvement other than giving feedback on the Zelda and Link character designs, which they wanted to ensure had at least a passing resemblance to the characters that Nintendo fans knew and loved. With Nintendo signing off on those designs, Animation Magic began working on the titles in earnest, and here they were given some pretty specific direction from Philips. They needed to use every single leading capability of the CDI console in some capacity for each title, including full motion video cutscenes, high-resolution graphics, and CD-quality audio. As you might imagine, Philips wanted to use the popular Nintendo license as effectively as possible, and they believed that by creating games with a slew of higher-quality multimedia capabilities, that they would attract a greater audience and potentially drive interested gamers to purchase a CDI console outright. Basically, they were looking at these Zelda titles as potential system sellers, the same way Nintendo might themselves turn to Zelda or Mario games to help sell their newest console offerings. Philips was hoping this might be an ace up their sleeve to drive even more attention to their relatively new home console. With that direction in mind, Philips gave Animation Magic a budget of $600,000 and 1 year total to create both titles, which honestly wasn't that much money and wasn't that much time to create 2 high-quality gaming experiences. So Animation Magic did something that, from my perspective, was pretty darn clever. They decided to create both games in conjunction with each other, reusing the same engine and many aspects of the overall design for both titles, which is why, like I mentioned before, both titles are pretty much the same general game, with only content differing between the 2. The thought in the team was that this was the only way to create two titles within the timeline and budgetary constraints Philips had given them. So rather than overtax their team and likely miss their deadline, they decided to try a more efficient, integrated approach to developing the two games. This integrated approach meant that the team would reuse pretty much every resource they had between the two titles, including the programming of the game's engine, the background artwork, and voice acting, which were both staffed by local creative talent near their company headquarters in New England, and the creation of both games' animated cutscenes, which would be created by a team of Russian animators that Animation Magic flew into the United States to work more closely with the primarily US-based development team. All told, nearly 90 individuals worked on the creation of both titles over the year that it took to bring them both to life, representing a pretty sizable team and a relatively large-scale endeavor, given the general state of the gaming industry around the early 90s. There was definitely a lot of focus on these two titles, and the teams working on them truly wanted to create something special. The thing is though, like we talked about, the Philips CDI was not designed to be a gaming console, but was instead created to be more of a device for passive content consumption or reference material review. What this meant is that anyone who wanted to create a true interactive game for the console needed to deal with some pretty severe system limitations, like less responsive control schemes than most dedicated gaming consoles, and a hardware design that didn't easily support streaming audio, video, and animations while processing other aspects of a title's underlying software, which, as you might guess, is pretty much required for any game to function like an actual game. Whether the Animation Magic team was able to overcome these limitations or not is something we'll discuss in a little bit, but suffice it to say, creating games for the Philips CDI was definitely an uphill battle. Eventually though, Animation Magic would in fact complete work on both titles, and Link: The Faces of Evil and Zelda: Wand of Gamelon would both release to market in late 1993 in both North America and Europe. These two games represented the very first Zelda series titles released on a non-Nintendo system, and because of that, there were some pretty high expectations for the titles. Well, luckily for Animation Magic and Philips CDI owners, both Zelda titles would receive high marks from a sizable number of game publications and critics around the world, with many praising the game's graphics, animated cutscenes, audio, and overall presentation. Some critics called the game's visuals breathtaking, while others described the animation as perfect, and something you might only be able to find in a high-quality arcade cabinet costing thousands of dollars, which was pretty high praise considering the limitations of the Philips CDI hardware. Now, there were, of course, some conflicting opinions, with some critics claiming the game's controls were too sluggish to be a worthwhile action-adventure title, while others criticized the game's overall quality when compared to the Nintendo-developed Zelda titles that had released up to this point. Even those reviews, though, were squarely in the mediocre camp. Not a single review I found or read suggested that either game was a bad experience. They were either praised as awesome or noted as middling, but still somewhat fun experiences. This somewhat mixed sentiment would begin to take a different trajectory entirely once modern internet users and YouTube luminaries rediscovered the titles in later years, where retrospective analysis has almost universally declared both The Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon to be among the worst games ever created in the entire history of the video game industry, with countless videos released that make fun of both titles' graphics and controls, soundtrack, general art style, and pretty much every other aspect of each game, with particular vitriol directed towards the game's animated cutscenes, which many people have suggested look like a toddler created them using Microsoft Paint, while others have called them, and I quote, cheesy, freakish, and an absolute joke. I'll reserve my own judgment until we discuss the specific aspects of the game in a little bit, but suffice it to say, the internet has not been kind to either title. You might think, considering how notorious and infamous both The Faces of Evil and its sister title Wand of Gamelon have become, that our discussion would simply end here, with two ignoble footnotes in video game history. Interestingly though, the story does continue, as some people have chosen to refute popular internet opinion by claiming that The Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon are, in fact, better than what they've been made out to be, and that there are worthwhile features available in both titles. Those claims recognize that they are both flawed efforts, but also suggested that they were not the miserable train wrecks that the majority of internet communities would have you believe. And one person in particular who thought more highly of the titles than the rest of the population was a man named Seth Fulkerson. In 2016, Fulkerson began imagining what a modern remake of the two titles using current tools and technologies would look like, and believed that with some tweaks to the gameplay along with the addition of modern amenities, the titles would, potentially, be more well-liked than their original versions. This began a 4-year effort where Fulkerson decided to teach himself game development, during which time he learned how to use the popular game development toolset GameMaker, and in the process ended up remaking both Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon for modern computer platforms. Fulkerson added a bunch of modern touches to both titles, including adding widescreen support for the graphics, subtitles for the game's various cutscenes, modified and refined control schemes, unlockable content, and the addition of a brand new gameplay mode called Remastered Mode, which combined all of the previously mentioned tweaks and added several other quality of life improvements to make a game that, hopefully, would be more widely appreciated than the original CDI versions of the titles. Now, Fulkerson realized he was in a legally gray area with the creation of these titles, and he knew Nintendo was, and is, an incredibly litigious company who actively goes after any projects that unofficially use characters and intellectual property from their games. Countless fan passion projects have been issued cease and desist letters over the years, with only one real course of action: shut down the project and, hopefully, avoid any further legal issues from the big N. Fulkerson knew that after he would release his remakes, he would almost certainly be targeted by Nintendo, even though Nintendo has all but disavowed the existence of these CDI Wish.com versions of their mascots. But he also really believed that his work should be experienced by the masses. So he did something somewhat clever. He ended up releasing both remakes in November of 2020 for the Windows and Linux computer platforms. The thing is, though, he only left them up for download for 2 days, after which he would take them down, never to be posted again. Of course, once something hits the internet, it literally lives forever. So even though he stopped distribution, effectively avoiding any legal blowback from Nintendo, he knew the remakes would remain in circulation. And to prove that out, simply type the phrase Faces of Evil Remake into Google and take a look at the very first Internet Archive search result. It's not exactly hard to find. Interestingly, those remakes would end up getting a fair amount of interest from press and gamers alike, so much so that Fulkerson began thinking that perhaps there might be an opportunity for a brand new game in the style of these CDI classics, but entirely separate from any pre-existing Nintendo or Philips intellectual property. So, in late 2020, Fulkerson created a new company called CDI Software, which was chosen to intentionally sound like Philips' CDI console name, and under that new company's umbrella, Fulkerson began taking all of the game development know-how he acquired over the last 4 years to begin creating a brand new title that would act as a sort of spiritual successor to both Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon. And with that goal in place, work on Arzette, the Jewel of Faramore, officially began. That, however, is a story that goes well beyond classic gaming. And if anyone is interested in learning more about that effort, we actually have an expansion pack episode on our Patreon feed that talks about that game's creation, as well as my thoughts on the title. Anyway, I find it refreshing that two ludicrously panned games could find newfound life via the efforts of someone who, at the time, was an amateur coder simply trying to learn how to develop a video game. It's fan support like that that keeps games alive well after they've fallen off the public's collective radar, and I for one commend and respect those efforts. Regardless of those modern remasters, the original CDI Zelda titles, and in particular the Faces of Evil, remain an interesting piece of video game history. As one of the few times that a Nintendo franchise favorite appeared on a non-Nintendo system, The Faces of Evil is, if nothing else, a unique Zelda title that attempts to capture the spirit and feeling of adventure that countless video game titles of the early to mid-90s delivered to gamers around the world. Whether Link: The Faces of Evil accomplished that goal or not is something we'll discuss in a couple minutes. But, despite my or others' opinions, the fact is that there's still a lot of interesting history to digest here, and as a result, Link: The Faces of Evil is certainly a title that deserves its time in the spotlight. While it may not be as well regarded as many other entries in the Zelda series, it is definitely a game that warrants your consideration and attention. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Link: The Faces of Evil today versus when it was released around 30-ish years ago. At its core, Link: The Faces of Evil is a side-scrolling platforming title, with some Metroidvania kinds of elements thrown in for good measure. As you navigate the various stages across the game's world, you'll get to jump across gaps, swing your sword to defeat enemies, and use a number of different items to help progress through your adventure, most of which are found either by defeating some big bad boss or completing one of a variety of side quests peppered throughout each stage. So, not really anything special, at least from a conceptual standpoint. But there is actually more here than what is obvious at first glance, both from a positive perspective as well as from a not so positive perspective. First though, I have to reiterate something I spoke about a little bit ago, which is the fact that The Faces of Evil and its sister title Wand of Gamelon have been so widely panned and critically roasted in recent years that you might think there is literally no redeeming quality in the titles. But, as I always do, I need to form my own opinion before passing judgment, which is why I spent one quiet Sunday afternoon playing through The Faces of Evil from beginning to end. What I discovered is, well, you'll have to listen to find out. So, let's talk about The Faces of Evil. The first thing you'll notice when you start the game up is a menu that allows you to either start a new game, load a previously saved adventure, or view some help that explains how to play. If you don't have a manual handy, I highly encourage you to watch the help video, which gives you some information that you would otherwise have no way of figuring out by simply playing the game. Watching the video, you'll learn that moving around is accomplished using your directional pad, as you might expect, and swinging your sword and using equipped items requires using 2 of the face buttons on your controller. Okay, pretty straightforward so far. But the piece that is critical, and something I did not figure out before I watched the video, is that the only way to open your inventory is by ducking and pressing the secondary item use button, which then allows you to equip any items you may have picked up and see the number of consumable resources you've collected, like rubies, lantern oil, and ropes. This kind of thing just goes to show you that for these older titles, you really do need to read the manual to stand a chance at succeeding. Though I will say, I thought it was a great touch to include a help video that explains how to play the game. Including instructions and tutorials in games was not the norm in the early 90s, and the fact that Animation Magic provided this user-friendly feature was actually pretty forward-leaning. Say what you will about the cheesy voiceover that actually tells you how to play, but the mere existence of a tutorial video was something I appreciated. Anyway, once you learn how to play the game, you can start a new adventure, which plays an introductory cutscene that is so good in its cheesy, ridiculously animated FMV style with questionable, albeit charming voice acting, after which you're dropped into the game's overworld map to truly begin your adventure. At the beginning of the game, you'll be able to see a pretty large overworld map, but only a handful of levels will be accessible to explore. This is entirely by design, as the core framework for the game involves you exploring individual stages, and assuming you make your way to the end of a stage, you'll find a Triforce map symbol, which if you slash it, will open up an additional stage to explore. This general framework applies to the majority of the game's levels, outside of the final stages, and what begins as a relatively lightweight affair with 3 levels available at the outset will balloon to a fairly expansive set of stages, with around 13 different multi-part levels to progress through. I will freely admit, the breadth of the game's world pleasantly surprised me, as I didn't expect there to be nearly as much content here as what the game actually has. Also pleasantly surprising was the way each level was designed, each of which included multiple scenes with a variety of requirements to progress through those scenes. Though I should mention that when you first start playing the game, there's a very real chance that you might not know what the heck is going on. Or at least I didn't know what was going on, because I quickly found myself in several areas that seemingly had no way to progress beyond. When I began the game, my first stop was an icy level named Nortinka, inhabited by a couple of different enemies, one of which drops snowballs that you can pick up and add to your inventory by slashing them with your sword, which is the way you interact with pretty much everything in the game world in Faces of Evil. Want to talk to a character? Slice them with your sword. Want to pick up an item? Slash it with your sword. Want to kill a bad guy? Cut him up with your sword. Want to buy an item? Politely ask the shopkeep. Nah, I'm just kidding. You need to slash the item with your sword. There has been some critique levied against the game surrounding this mechanic, but I've got to say, I never really had an issue with having to slash items to pick them up. Wouldn't it have been easier to simply walk into a ruby to add it to your inventory like the fan-made remaster implemented? Sure, it would have been, but the original design, while slightly more cumbersome, wasn't egregiously offensive, at least from my perspective. Anyway, back to Nortinka. I began progressing through the first part of the stage, defeating enemies along the way, picking up snowballs as I went. Eventually, I made my way into an igloo-like structure and defeated a series of enemies, one of which dropped a key. These keys are hidden throughout pretty much every level in the game, and they are essential for progression, as there's usually one or more locked doors in a stage that requires these keys to open. So, I pick up the key by slashing it, and then I made my way back to the beginning of the stage, which is where I had noticed the locked door previously. I go through the door and encounter my first non-player character, a woman frozen in ice. I speak with her by slashing with my sword, and she relays the fact that Ganon has frozen the area, and she could use our help. This is the first of what will become many side quests, and they all follow the same pattern. You talk to an NPC, they tell you what you need to do, often involving finding an item, and then you bring that item back, which grants you some sort of usable item or upgrade. These side quests, while super lightweight, were strangely interesting to me, as they added a degree of engagement with the game world that I did not expect. Plus, each of the NPC interactions were accompanied by the same kind of FMV animations and voiceover work that has become the butt of internet jokes around the world. And you know what? Those cutscenes, while not likely to win any awards, were actually shockingly charming, and the voice work wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. In fact, I'd argue that the much higher budget and more respected Resident Evil had worse voice acting than what was included in the Faces of Evil. Sure, some of the lines sounded like they were being delivered by an overexcited high schooler who really wants their parents to notice them, but for me, that was all part of the charm. Mild tangent aside, and returning once again to Nortinka, if you make your way through another door near the frozen ice woman, you'll find yourself in a series of caves populated by ice monsters that continuously pepper you with rocks. These enemies, you'll quickly find out, are completely invincible to your direct sword attacks, which basically means you've hit a brick wall. So at this point, you have one of two options. Either make your way back to the beginning of the level and slash the Triforce map symbol, which returns you to the overworld map, or die 3 times, which will also drop you back to the world map. The cool thing here is that the game is surprisingly user-friendly in terms of level progression. You have unlimited continues, and any progress you make in a given stage, like defeating a sub-boss or unlocking a door, will remain completed if and when you return to a stage. Really, the only potentially challenging aspect of the game is the fact that you only have 3 lives available to beat a stage, which is a bit of an impediment, but ultimately is a fair way to approach game design in a title like this. Returning to our initial playthrough, Nortinka was a no-go, so I decided to go to Garnu next, which features a shop right at the beginning of the stage where you can purchase bombs, which blow stuff up, ropes, which lets you climb from a lower platform to a platform above you, and lantern oil, which will eventually be used to power your lantern. Assuming you have some rubies, you can pick up some inventory items here, but if not, you can leave the shop and continue exploring the stage, which is exactly what I did. I made my way further into the level, eventually finding a rock blocking my path, which obviously requires some explosive might to get through. So I went back to purchase some bombs, made my way back to the rock, and blew up the impediment, allowing me to progress deeper into the stage. Only here, I discovered that the next section of the stage is pitch black. Obviously, I need some form of light to progress here, which I don't have yet, so I'm forced to retreat and go back to the overworld map. At this point, 2 of the 3 starting areas left me with minimal progress, so I then went to the third starting stage, Crater Cove. Entering this stage, I quickly moved away from a volcano spewing lava balls, eventually entering a house where I received a pretty awesome gift, an upgrade to my sword that let me fire energy beams from it, as long as I have full life. Awesome, a true game changer, if I can manage to not take any damage. That whole don't take damage thing was a short-lived dream, but I do manage to make my way into a nearby cave after being tipped off by an NPC that says she's hidden a key inside of an animal skull by the cave entrance. Key in hand, I unlock the door and progress into the cave, where I'm confronted with a bunch of red, presumably fire-based enemies that, just like the ice monsters from Nortinka, are entirely impervious to my attacks. At this point, I begin thinking to myself, what the heck is going on? I've explored the 3 starting stages, and I've seemingly hit a roadblock in each one. But then, I realize that I have an item that might in fact help me progress a bit. Those snowballs from Nortinka. Perhaps they can be used on the fire enemies in Crater Cove. I return to the cave, toss a snowball in the direction of the enemies, and they get absolutely decimated. One hit, one kill. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I go back to Nortinka, farm up some snowballs, and return to Crater Cove to progress through the fire cave. These bad guys drop fireballs, which it turns out are useful for dispatching the ice creatures in Nortinka in a sort of yin and yang kind of balance, which honestly, I kinda liked. So now I'm starting to get a feel for the game, and it's here where the feeling of being a Metroidvania really comes into play, because it's obvious that each stage has impediments that can only be traversed by collecting other items, which then unlocks more stages where you can acquire other items, and then contribute to progressing further in other stages, and so on. And now, at this point, I'm actually really liking the game, as it's ticking off a bunch of checkboxes and becoming more and more engaging along the way. While I'm not going to go over every stage and every item and every unlock I encountered, I've got to say, the rest of the game presents itself in a way that, for whatever reason, was super compelling to me, and I constantly looked forward to getting new items and revisiting past stages to see what new paths I could unlock, what new quests I could complete, and what new levels I could discover. Seriously, I was having a ton of fun here. Now, I feel like I should caveat this discussion a bit, because the game structure itself, like I mentioned, is actually pretty darn engaging. What I believe more people will have some issue with is the game's controls, combat, and general interaction with the game world. I'm not going to beat around the bush. The controls here are not smooth, and they are not particularly responsive. The thing is, though, that this control scheme is not nearly as awful as many would have you believe, and after around 30 minutes or so, I found myself jumping around, flinging energy beams without issue, changing direction to kill a nearby flying pterodactyl in midair, and otherwise having more fun than I probably should have given the game's and the CDI's inherent limitations. It is 100% true that the game does not feel nearly as responsive or smooth as most titles you'll see on a more traditional console from around this time, like the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. But at the end of the day, that didn't end up mattering to me because those issues were able to be gotten used to and ultimately surpassed. I'm not saying that there weren't certain occasions where I fell precipitously to my death after missing what was a very obvious jump that in any other game I would have landed. I'm also not saying that there weren't instances where I'd be surrounded by enemies and see my hit points drop like a rock without having any real ability to counterattack. And I'm also not saying that the way to defeat each enemy and boss was 100% intuitive. What I am saying, though, is that the game as a whole is simply fun to play, and from my standpoint, that counts for quite a bit. We're going to talk more about the more specific aspects of the game in just a minute, but first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet with all sorts of information available at our fingertips. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to reference. A lot of times when we made a buying decision, it was based either on reviews that we might have read in gaming magazines, word of mouth from friends, or looking at a game in the store and deciding for ourselves whether it looked cool enough to buy. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we flipped it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might actually buy it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Link, the Faces of Evil for the Philips CDI, the back of the box says, Link, the Faces of Evil. Ganon and his minions have seized the peaceful island of Korodai and imprisoned Zelda. It is written, only Link can defeat Ganon. To do so, he must conquer the hideous faces of evil, each more diabolic than the one before. Against all odds, Zelda must be freed and Korodai return to harmony. This fast-paced action-adventure game features 70 playfields. From the friendliest to the meanest, 90 astonishing characters will talk to you in full animation. Encounter the spear-throwing moblins, the rock-spitting Octoroks, and much more. Stunning visuals and full-motion animation, CD-quality audio and sound effects, original music, and thumbstick recommended. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, one of which shows a little shot of the animated cutscene, or an animated cutscene, and then the other shows a picture of what appears to be, I think it's one of the stages in the game. It's a little blurry on this particular image. I don't, unfortunately, have this as an actual jewel case because it's ridiculously expensive. But in any event, that is the back of the box. And I have got to say, the back of the box actually sells me on the game. If you look just at the screenshots and you look just at the text and knowing it's a Zelda game, or in the Zelda series, I should say, yes, I would have bought this if I owned a Philips CDI back when I was younger. And I think I've relayed this story before. I really wanted a CDI when I was younger. I would watch the CDI infomercial constantly at like 4 a.m. in the morning where they talked about the meaning of life, and you had the character named Phil and he was trying to understand what the CDI was, and this computerized voice was telling him, hey, this is the CDI, and they showed all the different images and FMV sequences and everything. Oh, I wanted a CDI back then. I do in fact have 2 CDIs right now because I guess I'm overcompensating for something, but regardless of that fact, I wish I would have had this back in the day. I wish I would own Link today, Link the Faces of Evil. It is just ridiculously expensive. This is one of those collectible video games that is really, really expensive to buy. And if I ever find one that's not so expensive, I will definitely pick it up. And even beyond that, the box as it exists, or as it existed, it definitely sold me on the title. Moving past the box, let's start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. For the most part, the graphics in Link Faces of Evil look quite good, with background artwork that feels whimsical, varied environments across every single stage, and oftentimes within individual stage selections inside of a given level, and character sprite work that is perhaps a bit more detailed than Nintendo's own 16-bit Zelda title, A Link to the Past. Seriously, the game looks really good. If we're all talking about the static artwork, then this game actually looks very, very nice. Animations, however, leave a little bit to be desired, and it's very obvious that there are not too many frames of animation allocated for each movement, both for your own actions as well as enemy interaction. This didn't really detract from my enjoyment of the game, as the animations, while kind of feeling like a staccato-centric musical piece, ended up taking on the role of something decidedly retro and ultimately charming. Yes, from a technical perspective, these animations are not great, but there's something about the stop-and-go animation aesthetic that for some reason appealed to me. If you're more sensitive to non-smooth animations, though, you may have a harsher critique here. I would also be remiss if I didn't draw attention once again to the FMV animated cutscenes, which, similar to the animations, do not really function the way any animations should from a technical perspective. They're cheesy, the proportions of characters are all wrong, and different aspects of each scene kind of fade in and out of existence randomly. The strange thing is, though, I didn't care as I was actually playing the game, as each adorably goofy cutscene ended up making me feel good inside. I know, that was weird for me too, but there's something endearing about the graphics here, and despite the fact that the technical execution of many of the visual elements of the title is, quite simply, not that great, the charm, and dare I say it, care that went into the creation of the game's graphics really shine through. Moving on to the sound and music, I can't lie on this one. The music in Faces of Evil freaking rules. I don't mean this ironically or as a it's so bad it's good kind of situation. The music is really, really good, with tracks that mesh perfectly with the action on the screen and are, in some instances, even catchy enough to be hummable outside of the game. Now, if I were to compare the songs here to any traditional Zelda title, it'd be very clear that the musical styles at play are entirely different. So if you're looking for a bunch of music that sounds epic and filled with adventure, Faces of Evil is going to be a swing and a miss. But if you're looking for music that is simply good within the context of the game that you're playing, there's a ton to like with this one. Sound effects, meanwhile, are nothing to write home about. They exist, they play when appropriate, and they're not offensive in any way, which at the end of the day is a good thing. More interesting to speak about is the game's voice acting, which ranges from absolutely terrible and amateur sounding all the way to pretty strong cartoon-styled voice work. The odd thing here is that even with some of the voice acting that is objectively bad, like Link's portrayal in the game, I still found it amusing and infinitely better than the stilted dialogue and acting in other titles, like the critically acclaimed first Resident Evil title, like I mentioned earlier, or any number of early 90s point-and-click adventure titles that used developers as stand-ins for real voice actors. I don't think the voice work in Faces of Evil is going to win any awards, but it is undeniably enjoyable to listen to, with even the cheesiest acting bringing a smile to my face. No real complaints here. I'm pretty impressed with the auditory environment in the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Link, The Faces of Evil, you play as Link, a Hylian adventurer who, after many years of defeating the minions of Ganon, is sitting around Hyrule Castle, bored out of his mind. Luckily, one day the great wizard Gwonam arrives at the castle and informs Link that his constant adversary Ganon has taken over the island of Korodai, a faraway island whose landscape is dotted with the titular Faces of Evil, a series of mountains bearing the faces of the enemies that live within each region. Link is tasked with defeating all of Ganon's minions before finally confronting the big bad guy himself, and hopefully saving the day and Princess Zelda once again. I've got to say, this story worked for me, as did the cutscenes that provided some story exposition as you progress throughout the game. The plot here was pretty straightforward, but honestly, was pretty standard fare for a Zelda series game from around this time in history, and I don't really have any critiques or complaints to levy against the narrative. It's there, it works, and it provides appropriate motivation for the adventure you're about to undertake. For an action platforming title, what more can you ask for? Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked about the general structure of the game and how many aspects of its mechanics mirrors the Metroidvania genre that would become popular in the later 90s, so I'm not going to rehash that all here. What I do want to talk about, though, is the general responsiveness of the controls, an aspect of the game's playability that I mentioned briefly before, but likely warrants some additional discussion. First, though, a quick refresher on the game's controls. You move around with your directional pad, you swing your sword with your first controller face button, you use any equipped items with your second controller face button, you duck and press your second controller button to open your inventory screen, and you press up on your directional pad to jump. Overall, not a strange control scheme for a game released in the early 90s. And for the most part, the controls worked adequately well in many of the situations you find yourself in. When they don't work, though, oh boy, do they really not work. The biggest culprit here is the way you jump, which, like I mentioned, involves pressing up on your directional pad, often combined with either pressing left or right to jump diagonally. Conceptually, that makes sense, but the controls can be pretty finicky, with actually moving in the direction you want to jump, which manifests itself as missed jumps over seemingly easy to traverse gaps, which oftentimes means you've either fallen to your death or fallen down a mountain that you had previously scaled. This is never a huge issue, as each stage is relatively small, and getting back up to where you previously were, even if you have to restart from the beginning of a stage, is surprisingly quick. But I would be lying if I didn't mention at least some frustration associated with the jump mechanics in the game. This is definitely something that needs to be gotten used to. Attacking and using items, meanwhile, is another area that mostly works, except when it doesn't, and here the biggest issue is the fact that enemies often attack from varying heights, either because they're moving on a floor that's either sloped or at a different height from your location, or because you're getting attacked by a flying enemy that constantly changes its altitude based on your position in the level. Timing attacks to hit those flying enemies in particular takes some getting used to, though for most of the game it's not a major issue. This all changes late in the game, and especially in Ganon's Lair, which is when you begin fighting enemies that deal significantly more damage than the enemies you faced up to that point. I did experience some frustrating, somewhat cheap deaths at the hands of some enemies that were simply hard to target, with perhaps my least favorite enemy in the game being a snake-like creature that slithers across the floor of several levels of Ganon's castle. You can get past these creatures, but if you get caught unaware, you'll be swarmed and unceremoniously killed. Be prepared for a bit of frustration when you get to this part of the game. Otherwise, though, the game is surprisingly free of frustration or unfair challenge. If you can get past the responsiveness of the controls and some of the wonky jumps you need to execute and enemy positioning that makes it difficult to accurately hit some bad guys, I truly believe you'll find a pretty darn fun experience. Between the items that change how you play the game, to the weapon upgrades that come with a noticeable increase in power, to the heart container upgrades that make your survivability skyrocket, all of those features and more combine to make Link: The Faces of Evil way more interesting and fun than how it's typically portrayed by internet critics. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Faces of Evil is without flaws or frustrations, particularly with its control responsiveness and certain enemy types being a pain to deal with. But even with those flaws, the game was simply fun to play, and I barely noticed the 4 hours I spent playing the title. It felt like a breezy, constantly evolving experience, and I honestly believe it's a perfect summer afternoon kind of game, where you can open your windows and let a warm breeze blow across your face as you're whisked away to a land that requires little in the way of commitment to eventually defeat, and is surprisingly lenient in its punishments for player missteps. Every aspect of the title, while oftentimes not technically proficient, is obviously something that was designed with positive intention, and I truly got the feeling that the development team wanted to do something special with the coveted Zelda license they were entrusted with. I know Faces of Evil doesn't feel like a traditional Link adventure, but that shouldn't diminish what it is, which is a simple, engaging, and overall fun experience. So what is our verdict on Link: Faces of Evil? Well, as I sat trying to think about how to rate Link: Faces of Evil, I had to pause for a second, because I know, because the internet told me so, that Faces of Evil is not a good game. So, when I reflected on my experience and realized I actually had a good time playing the game, I had to wonder, did I miss something? Was I in some weird state of eternal optimism that made Faces of Evil feel like a better game than what it really was? I legitimately wrestled with these thoughts for longer than I should have before I finally realized I knew the answer all along. Is Link: The Faces of Evil a bad game? No, it absolutely is not. Is Link: The Faces of Evil a technically competent title? Honestly, not really, as there are too many limitations of the CDI system to really compare to most dedicated gaming hardware. The most important question, though, is whether Link: The Faces of Evil is a fun enough title to play today. And to that, I answer a resounding yes, which is just as much of a shock to me as it likely is to most of you. Which is why, against all odds, the internet's choice for one of the worst games of all time has just become the newest addition to our list of golden oldies. There are definitely some janky elements here, and the game has plenty of flaws that I could choose to pick at. But the entirety of the experience was exceedingly charming, decidedly old school, and endearingly fun. And from my perspective, that combination greatly exceeded my expectations. It is not the best game ever made, and it certainly isn't comparable to many Zelda series titles. But what it is just fun enough, and just engaging enough, to warrant its recognition as the newest member of our collection of golden oldies. That was our episode on Link: The Faces of Evil. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on King's Quest, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to see where I'm hitting the mark and where we may have some tweaks to make. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow our community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on King's Quest. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.